really open this up to a discussion with people in the room, as well as people that may be watching online. So you can send your questions to us via Twitter, which is @SynBioProject, and we will get those questions from you, and then they'll relay them to us, and then we'll announce them out loud. And I'll be saying @SynBioProject over and over again, so you know what that Twitter handle is. We like to use Twitter because it forces you to keep your questions short. So we'll try to keep that same idea with people in the room when you're asking your questions. So just sort of to give kind of some context to this, and this report that's up here is also outside on the table that we put out a couple of weeks ago, is to show that there's significant funding happening in the US government from a federal research standpoint. So this idea of synthetic biology is certainly not sort of out in the future. This is happening now. There are products on the market now. There are applications sitting at US agencies' desks. So why this report looks at the present and the future, I wanted to sort of show you kind of from a money standpoint why this is important to look at. So what the report that we just put out show that since 2008, it's about $815 million has been spent, give or take, $100 million or so probably, from US federal agencies, specifically in synthetic biology. Our methodology for how we came up with that number is in the report, so I won't go into that. But some of the big takeaways to this is actually who's doing this funding. So if you look at this graph up here, that orange bar in the back there, which is the largest funder in the US government, is actually coming from DARPA. That next bar down from that is the Defense Department outside of DARPA. And then the next one there is NSF. So it's about 2/3 of all of the US funding right now in synthetic biology is actually coming from the Defense Department. That may or may not become important later on in terms of evaluating these types of organisms, products, and applications. And it becomes even more significant when you dive deeper into those numbers and you look at the risk research around synthetic biology, so the ecological impacts, human health impacts. That total number is actually less than 1% of that total funding that the US government is investing right now is in risk research, which we think may become an issue later on, and that we think a small investment up front can actually teach you not just about what some of those potential risks might be, but can also help you to understand the organism's interactions in particular environments that can actually help you engineer better organisms. So then just real quickly, this is a pie chart of all of the funding, including the United Kingdom and the European Commission. And the interesting thing about this, beyond sort of, again, the large chunk that DARPA has in there, is if you actually take out the defense spending from the US, the UK is actually investing more right now in synthetic biology in terms of basic science. So that UK number is basically the equivalent agencies as the National Science Foundation. And the United Kingdom has a roadmap for synthetic biology, something that the US government hasn't developed quite yet. So this is not just a US investment standpoint. Other nations in the world are investing heavily in synthetic biology. So while this report focuses on the US regulatory system, there are sort of global governance questions as well, as most of the companies involved in synthetic biology are global international companies. And then if you really want to see what these actual products or applications are, some of them which are actually on the market now, you can go to our website. We have an interactive inventory of synthetic biology products and applications where you can see the different types of areas that people are working on different products, from chemicals, health products, pharmaceuticals, and the like. And this is actually interactive, and we designed this to, in essence, have crowdsourcing capabilities. So we actually are encouraging companies to go in here, sign up for user accounts so you can start adding products, making adjustments to ones that are in there. And in the future, we hope to have enough information that you can click on a product and actually start and see where the regulatory system may come into play for that particular product. So this is another sort of useful tool to get a better understanding of the field in general. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Lynn, who's going to go through the report.
Thank you very much, Todd, and welcome, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you so much for being here today, and for everyone who's watching, hello. I am joined today by my colleagues, Cheryl Dolan and Dr. Richard Engler, because our report was very much a collaborative effort, and we'll get into that in a few minutes. But before reviewing the report, I wanted to reflect for just a moment on how Bergeson and Campbell came to be engaged in this project. And it all started really a number of years ago when we were working with the Woodrow Wilson Center on its project on emerging nanotechnologies. And if you recall, the PEN project, as it came to be known, developed a series of very, very, very good scholarly reports on the intersection of evolving technologies as they related to nanotechnology and evolving and current statutory and regulatory governance frameworks. And it's in that space that our firm, a law firm, works. We represent a lot of different innovators and others in emerging technologies, either manufacturing new technologies that give rise to new chemicals or chemicals that are the result of the emerging technologies. And one of the areas that we as a team find both fascinating is the application of our existing statutes and governance structures as they currently exist, and how they apply to these very, very innovative new technologies and new products of technologies. And it's that intersection that both excites us as practitioners, gets us going as advocates, and kind of, on occasion, I'm happy to admit, frustrates us as individuals, because sometimes the application of new and innovative and existing governance structures and ancient laws is not an easy fit. So when Dave Rajetsky and Todd reached out to us to see if we'd be interested in trying to summarize the U.S. statutory scheme that exists with respect to synthetic biology and the evolving governance structures and paradigms that apply to the regulation and government approval of these projects, we jumped at the opportunity. Because we think that there's an awful lot to say. There's a good deal to be said that is positive as to how that process is evolving. And there are a number of opportunities that we believe, and we outline in our report, that could be pursued to improve that process. The report is very, very, very much a collaborative effort. Two of the co-authors are with me here today, Cheryl and Rich. Not with me are the folks that are identified on this slide. And also, I want to give a shout out to Charlie Auer. Charlie, as you know, was the former director of the Office of Pollution Prevention and Toxics at EPA. He is now president of Charles Auer and Associates, and he participated in this report also, giving his insights as to the application of the Toxic Substances Control Act to these technologies. So although I'm here as a spokesperson on behalf of the firm and the co-authors of the report, it is very much a collaborative effort. And I also want to thank Todd and Dave and Aaron and others here at the center for their extraordinary effort in preparing the report and getting it out. Before I go through the recommendations, I really wanted to tell you what the report is and what it isn't. What we did in trying to lay out the landscape here is we went systematically through each of the major federal statutes that has a play in the regulation and governance of synthetic biologies. That would include the Toxic Substances Control Act, the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act, the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, the Plant Protection Act, and to some extent NEPA, the statute that applies under certain circumstances. We then went through a number of case studies, real-world case studies, to give the reader a sense of what an innovator might be expected to confront when he or she offers up a new technology in this space and seeks to commercialize it. And everybody in this room, and I see a lot of familiar faces that are very sophisticated people with respect to the application of these statutory authorities and regulatory systems as it applies to new innovations. But for people who are coming out of universities or new innovators in this space and have a fabulous new technology that falls into this general area that we call synthetic biology, the regulatory infrastructure here in the United States is a daunting challenge. And the process is, in many cases, neither clear, predictable, transparent, or in some places, coherent. And that's not an indictment of how we do things, it's just a reflection of how things have matured over the passage of time. If you look at our statutory framework, many of these statutes are 30, 40 years old and beyond, and certainly didn't anticipate or even foresee in any meaningful way the evolution of technologies that are now present here and ready to be commercialized. So what we thought we would do is present this report in the context of and from the perch of an innovator. In other words, an entity that has a new technology, a new widget, a new pixie dust that now wishes to go commercial. And it's from that perspective that the case studies evolved. And each chapter begins with a case study to kind of position the reader to get a sense of what the process might be, because many of these technologies are not only subject to one statute, they might be subject to multiple statutes depending upon the intent of the product and the claims made with respect to the product. And similarly, you might be subject to not one office within a federal agency, but multiple offices. And if multiple offices in all cases and under all circumstances may not be aware of who has a piece of the product and what the trajectory is for commercialization, that understandably invites some small level of anxiety on the part of the innovator, most certainly significant anxiety on the part of the financial backers of that technology. And to the extent that the trajectory as to when that product goes into the process for approval and when it might exit and by what pathway is what gives rise to a lot of the concerns, delays, and lack of predictability. And I think we are all joined at the hip with regard to wanting to commercialize products that will improve society, that offer enhancements to human health and the environment, while at the same time ensuring that the statutory mandate for assuring the safety of these products is in all cases met. The tricky part is harmonizing those two sometimes disparate but very much joined at the hip objectives. How do we get products out there? How do we make safety findings? And how can we help educate the public, all kinds of stakeholders, including our friends on Capitol Hill, the regulatory community at the federal agencies, and the public as to what these products are and what they are not. So I would urge you to take a look at the July 2nd memo from the various federal agencies that reflect the White House's commitment to modernize, in a very short period of time, the coordinated framework. And in that regard, I wanted to note one other important development, which came out just October the 6th, a Federal Register notice seeking public comment on targeted questions that are very much aligned with our recommendations. The comment period is close in. It ends on November the 13th. Today is October the 15th. But OSTP seeks answers to questions that are directly relevant to what we are urging here in our report. For example, how can federal agencies improve their communication to consumers, industry, and other stakeholders regarding the authorities, practices, and bases for decision-making used to ensure the safety of the products of biotechnology? The government is asking for relevant information and data, including case studies. We're going to be submitting our report to the docket that can inform and update the coordinated framework or the development of a long-term strategy regarding how to improve the transparency, coordination, predictability, and efficiency of the regulatory process. Another question, what additional clarification can be provided regarding which biotechnology product areas are within the statutory authority and responsibility of each agency? These questions are spot on. And to the extent we as citizens, forget being advocates, forget having clients, but just as citizens of the world, to the extent that we can contribute answers to these questions to help build a better system for the review, approval, transparency, and predictability of these new innovative technologies, we should do so. And if anyone is interested in collaborating on a voluntary basis with us, we're happy to get comments out there. As I said, the comment period ends very, very soon, November the 13th. This is a tall ask, and we've toyed with the idea of asking the government for a little more time, but I know some of the asks under the July 2nd memorandum are within a year of the issuance of the July 2nd memorandum. So the federal agency, which has developed a work group of all the pertinent offices within the federal family, are working on this. But this is a fabulous opportunity for all of us, whether you're a member of the public, an innovator, a member of the academic community, or others, to help pull information together that will better inform how we can develop a process that is clear, transparent, predictable, and informed, so the regulatory agencies involved in the decision-making process can make informed, prudent, timely decisions. In that regard, what I would like to do now is just turn the podium over to my colleagues, Cheryl Dolan and Rich Engler, and go through just two of the case studies, one of which is not actually in your materials, but we thought it's an interesting comparison of how we use the case study process as a way to help educate anybody who reads the report as to the upsides and some of the disconnects with the current regulatory system and how it might arrive at decisions that are probably well thought out, but not particularly anticipated or certainly according to a pathway that any of us can easily rationalize or predict its outcome. So Cheryl's going to talk about one case study and then turn it over to Rich. Go ahead.
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Lynn. Consistent with Todd's remarks about funding, innovation is clearly waiting for no one, and that's a good thing for our economy, and hopefully a good thing for solving a lot of the world's problems, but does, present its set of regulatory challenges. One case, or sorry, I was trying to think of how to organize this.
Well, just a first example. that's
Well,
not in the
right. No.
report.
Exactly. We had to cut off the report somewhere, and certainly once it ended, synthetic biology products and their regulatory challenges continue to come up on our radar. One example of that involves the company Oxitec. We do talk about Oxitec in the report, but in connection with a different product that Rich will talk about. But their new or different product, Oxitec took on the diamondback moth, which is a scourge globally, and it is a problem for a number of agricultural crops. Oxitec proceeded to apply the technology that it's developed to help control the moth population. It does a genetic modification, and that modification basically it introduces a gene that produces a protein that prevents the female larva from maturing. And it gums up the works, if you will. I mean, there's a much better explanation on the Oxitec website. And the expression in that gene is controlled through the application of tetracycline, which can be done in the lab, but then when the moth is released through the breeding cycles, it results in a reduction in the population. The female larvae don't mature. Oxitec, the regulation of this product is a good example, actually, of one that maybe fits a little bit better into the existing paradigms. Oxitec, working with my alma mater, Cornell, submitted a application to APHIS in USDA, and that seems to fit. This moth is a plant pest. APHIS has jurisdiction over plant pests through the Plant Protection Act, and it has a process in place for conducting that review. It conducted that review. It published an environmental assessment and published notice of that assessment in the Federal Register and took comment. And last fall, November 2014, I think, they gave permission to proceed with, for Oxitec to take the experiment out of the laboratory and do some limited field trials. To go to Lynn's point about demystification, however, I know they certainly encountered, and Cornell encountered, a lot of resistance and concern about, safety issues associated with the moth. So at least in this past August, the field trials that were conducted at Cornell were somewhat limited. They were field, but they were contained still, and in order to respond to some of the concerns about the release of these moths. And so they've gathered that data and completed that set, although even though APHIS had authorized a broader, field release, that's something that may be in the cards for the next agricultural season. But here's a case where, Oxitec wished to proceed with their synthetic biology product. There was a pathway forward that was reasonably well-defined, and they could go forward, and the process worked. We had notice and comment, and it proceeded as planned. That's in contrast to another Oxitec product, which we talk about in the report. It is one of our case studies.
Yeah, the Oxitec technology that's in the report is a genetically modified mosquito, which, unlike the diamondback moth, is not a plant pest, so it's not regulated by the Plant Protection Act. And then there's some question about which statutory authority applies. Is this a technology that's preventing or mitigating disease in humans? In which case, maybe it's a drug device. So is the mosquito a drug device? Regulated by FDA. Is it a pesticide? Is it is this a technology that's controlling a pest population? In which case, perhaps it's regulated by FIFRA, EPA, in the Office of Pesticide Programs. There's also a possibility that it's an animal drug that would be regulated under Center for Veterinary Medicine and FDA, where it would be more like technologies that have been used to control other wild populations that aren't necessarily falling under the pesticides. And eventually, after a lot of discussion among the regulatory agencies, that's what they settled on, that this would be regulated as an animal drug under Center for Veterinary Medicine for minor species. So it's the Office of Minor Species in CVM. And it seems sort of like a convoluted route to get to that, but it really isn't obvious which authority applies. But CVM moved ahead with public meetings. We have not yet seen a Federal Register notice for notice and comment on the test. There was a proposed test in the Florida Keys where they do some limited testing. The mosquitoes have been tested in South America. They've been rather successful, and presumably that data will inform the regulatory decision. But there isn't yet that opportunity for the public to weigh in on the specific ask from CBM. But it's a very similar technology to the moth. So they've essentially taken the same idea of using this the gene that prevents the female larvae from maturing and therefore reducing the breeding population in the wild. But moving it from one organism to another moves the regulatory authority, and depending on what pests they target next, it might move again. So the review expertise that exists in USDA in APHIS, it may be very different than what's available in the Center for Veterinary Medicine, and may be very different than what's in the pesticide program. So you may get a very different read as the innovator. You may get a very different read from these various regulatory agencies, and have success in one place and challenges in another. And you may have very different. The various regulatory agencies may have different expertise in dealing with the notice and comment, dealing with the public concerns, and answering those concerns. So there's not only not predictability about who's got authority, but then what happens to those various technologies as they move through the regulatory review. But a lot more detail in the report, and maybe the next round we'll have the diamondback moth as a case study.
I think what we will be doing is working with the Wilson Center to update these case studies as additional opportunities present themselves, because part of the goal here is to share information. And nothing that we say in the report is intended to point fingers at anyone. I mean, we really sympathize with the federal family of regulators in trying to keep up with the astonishing pace of technology and using these somewhat inflexible statutory constructs to put these round pegs in square holes. I mean, there's a certain amount of elasticity, and I think we share in large part the Venter Institute's conclusions that as to the core environmental statutes that are defined in our report, we believe there is sufficient statutory authority to get to the right result here. But it's the process of getting there, the making of the sausage that is dense, impenetrable, unpredictable, and on which I think we all, as stakeholders, can participate better, more actively, and more assertively in sharing information to help those that are in positions of decision-making with respect to the deployment of these authorities on technologies. Let's be more proactive in getting to yes here. And we've given some thought to how can we do that. I think I've already expressed our willingness to participate in just forming some comments in response to the October the 6th Federal Register notice. I'm not even sure a lot of people know that that Federal Register notice was issued and the importance of the questions asked and how pivotal that information is going to be to inform the judgment of the working group that's working with the modernizing of the coordinated framework. We kicked the tires, too, on perhaps developing some draft guidance documents, because people that have gone through the process, not looking at it from afar or looking at it kind of academically, but actually gone through the process of getting a new technology commercialized, we thought it would be helpful if we actually drafted guidance to help FDA, EPA, the various offices within those agencies, USDA and APHIS, so they can better anticipate and appreciate what the various points of intersection are and where the disconnects lie, because there are gaps in how the agencies can go about deploying their authorities and reviewing these products. We appreciate that. The question is, how do we best identify those gaps? How are those gaps met? And how can we be more proactively helpful in anticipating some of the challenges that regulatory agencies can anticipate and lead them to a conclusion that perhaps is more transparent and more predictable than what we now have. It is not an easy process, and there's no one silver bullet. But because so many of our clients are new innovators that are not nearly as informed as this group, they might not actually necessarily know that something is subject to a TSCA Section 5 new chemical notification. They might not know that the Center for Veterinary Medicine may have a role to play. And how do we go about providing a trajectory that is helpful and avoids the types of delays that are very discouraging to financial backers? And if you've got a fabulous new technology that will offer society incredible benefit, how can we help the process to get that subject to the approvals that it needs, but do so in a way that doesn't cause the frustration, the delays, and perhaps the sacrifices that are made because there is no clear pathway and people do give up, and then resources are lost and products are not innovated. So we think there's a lot of opportunity. Our report is largely intended to identify what some of those are. And the case study process, we think, is very helpful in using teachable moments as to where the disconnects are and what might be done to help improve the process. So with that, Todd, why don't we open it up to questions?
Yeah, so thank you for that. So we're going to open it up for questions in the room, and as the moderator, I'm going to take my prerogative of trying to maybe unpack this Oxitec situation, because I actually think it actually raises a number of questions. And I guess I have a couple of questions about that. The one is, I think a basic one, is what are they regulating? I mean, so we now have basically, from my understanding, the same technology. The genetic construct is the exact same. It's being looked at by two separate agencies. And so I was wondering if you could go into a little more detail about what those agencies are looking for, because my guess is that they're looking at different things in terms of what the impacts of those are. But in essence, you have the exact same result because you're releasing the organism out into the environment, but you have yet two different agencies with different purviews in terms of data requirements and questions that they're asking. So the basic question I have is, one, is what are they regulating? It's obviously the product, but they're looking at the genetic construct in terms of what that product is. And then also, if you could get into what those different data requirements are, and why that is important and how that could impact a company depending on what the product is used for, and then maybe speculate a little bit of if and when Oxitec moves this into a different insect or species, whether it could then, at some point, my guess is then it's gonna wind up at EPA potentially at one point. And then, so those are three, but then to sort of broaden that out around this product versus process question. Because we get a similar type of question when you look at the glowing plants question, particularly the Kickstarter example, where you have the seeds that the company itself is developing is using a gene gun technique, right? So that is the one that sort of escaped, if you want to call it that, right? The review process of USDA. However, the kits that they're providing to people are using agrobacterium, which does trigger that law. But at the end of both of those processes, you have the exact same product. But in that instance, one product is getting looked at while the other product is not. So it seems, in my non-lawyer purview, that then they are looking at the process in that question. So I was wondering if you can maybe sort of unpack that a little bit and sort of what your thoughts are in that realm.
Well, and Todd, I think you're hitting on one of the places where we see this weird gap and maybe opportunity for where there is a little legislative solution required. For the moth, I mean, under the Plant Protection Act, APHIS has jurisdiction if the technology, if it has something to do with a plant pest. So here, the diamondback moth clearly is a plant pest. It's a higher order organism to which the genetic modification is being made. So APHIS permission was needed, consistent with its jurisdiction, to originally for Cornell to bring the moth into the country, even just for the in-lab evaluation, and then separately for the field releases. And there's I don't have the list. I think we get into a little bit in the background discussion under the Plant Protection Act, but a variety of mammalian health and agricultural impact, non-target species impact information had to be provided. APHIS did, particularly the environmental impact assessment. There was no expectation that the moth would get into the human food supply, but there were data provided related to the consumption of the moth by non-target species, by spiders and fish, and there were a number of organisms. And I think this has been fairly transparent. APHIS did this review, and I think that close to 300 comments and responded to that. So there you had kind of a risk assessment, a fairly strong science-based risk assessment done in support of that analysis, in support of their conclusion that there was no adverse effects anticipated from this technology. Now with the mosquito.
Well, the mosquitoes, I mean, the Center for Veterinary Medicine's got a different authority, a different point of view. They're looking.
And I was going to say, we should say that wasn't APHIS because there's no plant pest. There was no plant pest. The mosquito wasn't considered a plant pest. I'm sure we can all recognize what it's a pest for. And there are a number of genetic modifications in which we should say, I think to start, that APHIS has jurisdiction over, not because of what the pest or what the recipient organism is of the genetic modification, but because historically there's been the process of doing the genetic modification involved microbes, involved species that were themselves plant pests. So you had plant pest DNA being used in the actual process, and so that's kind of the hook that brought in APHIS's jurisdiction. And that's one of the challenges with synthetic biology and what got us to the glowing plant and some of the other case studies where we see gaps where APHIS said, hey, no plant pest was involved. We don't have jurisdiction. We can't touch this. So that was the case here with mosquito. The mosquito is not a plant pest, and the technology involved did not involve a plant pest. So APHIS didn't have jurisdiction. So then it was up to the coordinated framework to figure out where to put this, which round hole to put this square peg.
And part of the discussion is what are the claims that are being made by Oxitec? Are they going to make claims about disease prevention? Are they going to make claims about pest control? And those claims, in addition to how the technology functions, those claims can trigger statutory review under the various statutes. But because they didn't do any of those things, and this fell to CVM, the CVM review is, and again, it's still ongoing. There's still a lot of that's not been disclosed about what they're going to consider. But they've certainly got a different focus than APHIS will. Less focus because it's not a plant pest. Less focus on sort of the agricultural impacts, and but they will look at. Presumably, they will look at the ecosystem impacts, the food chain issues that are associated with it, and in terms of getting to what are they regulating, they're regulating the organism, the genetic construct that's in the organism. There's actually two. One is the lethal gene, the tetracycline dependent gene, and the other is a UV marker that that people in the field can use to identify which organisms contain the genetic modification. Those constructs are the same, but it's the question is how do those genetic modifications impact what they're reviewing under their own authority? And there should be a fair amount of overlap, but because it's different statutory authorities, there's going to be different focus on that review.
And there's certainly been a lot more focus on the mammalian health, the human health aspect, and it's a little unclear based on what's been published, what is CVM's bandwidth for doing the non-target species impacts, the environmental impacts.
But going into the glowing plant, the key difference there with the gene gun, there was no plant risk because the plant pest species, the agrobacterium, isn't present. So that's a case where the way that they make the organism changes the statutory authority as opposed to the genetic construct itself, that final product. But because the gene that they made with the gene gun was not regulated by APHIS, then the plant comes out one way, and then the microorganisms that they used the similar technology for ended up under TSCA because it wasn't regulated elsewhere.
Right. So, I mean, in some ways, we can kind of, as part of this process and part of this report, we can kind of follow through, and we can enter the maze puzzle and kind of follow it around. And when we get to the answer, which isn't always the one that we predict at the end of the maze, it's like, all right, well, I can kind of see why you ended up there, which it would have been nice to have that more transparent, and heaven knows how some of our clients would figure that out. But you're obviously asking exactly the right questions. Where we end up, does it have capacity? Does CVM really have the capacity to do the environmental impact assessment for the critters that might eat those mosquitoes? And that's certainly been part of the question that I think the citizens of Florida have been asking. Sorry, I lost my thought again. I'll
Just
turn it back to you.
one quick comment, then I'll open it up to the floor. I mean, what Oxitec represents to me is if I was Oxitec, I would be asking a very simple question of saying, well, my moth is already approved. Why am I still waiting for FDA to approve my mosquito, which is still sort of under review, when at the end of the day, you have in essence the same product. It's serving the same purpose. You're trying to reduce a particular species. And so why is it that I'm going to USDA for a moth and I'm going to FDA for a mosquito, and I may be going, who knows, to EPA for something else, when at the end of the day, my technology is reducing the number of that particular species in the population size. So I don't know if that's a question or a comment in terms of, from a company standpoint, have you seen this before in terms of that type of regulatory system where in essence you have the exact same product and you're going through very different regulatory structures?
Well, I mean, yes.
Okay.
Right. The same overlap is true for chemistry. You have a particular chemical can be regulated by a variety of statutory authorities, and even within FDA, a variety of different centers at FDA. So, with a new substance, a new chemical substance, traditional chemical substance, you've got that same sort of stovepipe review, and one would hope that the data that serves review for one would support the review for another, but that part of that is the communication among the regulatory groups, and that's part of the importance for the coordination.
I mean, another example, a dual jurisdiction product where you'd have a hand sanitizer that'd be regulated by FDA and a hard surface sanitizer that'd be regulated as a pesticide under EPA. It can be the same formulation. And they go to different places and, you know, we've had that evolution statutorily and regulatorily, so there's the capacity in each agency to address those issues, and they do have different focuses. You know, so it may be that, I mean, that these, what needs to be done to address synthetic biology may not be a complete overhaul, but it's definitely poses a number of new questions. And again, like I said, coming back to the glowing plan, there are gaps.
Well, and to your point, Todd, whether or not it's the exact same thing to achieve the exact same purpose, I think, you know, the regulatory agencies might disagree a little bit. Mode of action, claims made, specific applications all go to bestowing upon the agencies whose jurisdictional hook is going to land on that product. And to the extent that the modernizing of the coordinated framework might provide more transparency as to what that group of entities within the coordinated framework might be talking about, what are the factors that are most relevant, what are some of the triggers that will cause the off-ramping to go over to FDA, Center of Veterinary Medicine, or EPA, or TSCA. Those are exactly the issues that confound us as advocates and lawyers for representatives of these innovations, and certainly confound the public in asking questions just like you did. It was like, well, wait a minute. If this is the same critter and it's achieving the same goal, why is one being redressed over here at APHIS and the other over here at FDA? And it's in part just a function of the statutory structure that we have and the opportunities for regulation depending upon what a specific mode of action is, whether something is biologically, genetically modified, and what are the claims made with respect to that product. Sarah, did you have a comment?
Hold on, let me get
sorry.
you a mic.
I was just going to add something along the same lines that Lynn said, was that those two products that you mentioned are really different products. And this is what gets back to our system being a product-based thing. You can't just say, I genetically engineered it in this way, and therefore it will have these risks. I mean, you know, one is a moth, and a nasty one at that has a specific sort of niche in its ecosystem. The other is a mosquito. That's something really different. That has a totally different life cycle. It's in different places, different communities, different targets, participates in different food webs. And so, you know, this is sort of the strength of the regulatory system in a important way, that they don't just say, oh, you use this, you know, hammer, and whatever you can hammer, you know, will all turn out the same, because that's, you know, not true sort of in the lab, and it's not true about the impacts. And the same is true for your Kickstarter example. You know, when they ship the whole plants, what they have is a whole plant that's been engineered but does not have any plant pests. But when they're shipping a plant pest, an agrobacterium, that's, you know, it's, to me, it's pretty clear why they would see that differently. And
Well,
even
but
though
it's
even
not
though the plant
shipping,
pest,
it's the individual who receives that kit has to get the permit. So
But
there
yeah,
are
but-
shipping answers to that, but what I was trying to say was that at the end of both of those processes,
yeah.
you have the exact same product,
No,
right?
but the product in one case is the plant, the product in the other case is
No,
the
they're both
agrobacterium.
seeds.
Oh, they are?
When you get the kit from Kickstarter, that kit is for you as the individual to be able to produce the seeds that will make the plant,
Then-
right? And so, and as the backer,
Then
you
one of them
getting
has
your
an
physically,
agrobacterium, though.
the kit has the agrobacterium,
yeah.
right? So, but the question is like, well, at the end of both of those, you have the exact same seeds, right? And so and to push back a little bit about what I was trying to say with Oxitec is that, so I'm an environmental scientist by training. I have the same questions that I want to ask when I'm talking about releasing whether it's a moth, a mosquito, or what have you, into an ecosystem. And so the question I have, and from a transparency standpoint, is APHIS and now FDA asking the exact same ecological impact questions? And my guess is that they're not. And so that, I think, is where, and also from a public perception standpoint, the problems are going to come in, because the reality, yes, it's a different species, they're interacting differently, but those ecological questions are exactly the same in terms of the impact, right? And whether those are being asked in separate agencies, I think, it's an open question. I don't know the answer to that, but my guess is the answer is no.
Sorry
Right,
to
so we'll-
dominate. Just
Yeah, go ahead.
building on that, though, if possible. A lot of the ecological questions will come up under NEPA, and instead of under the, different places, different agencies, actual statutory purview. And I don't know much about how this, from a practitioner's standpoint, is how does a NEPA process differ by agency? To me, it should be the same, or at least it's, any environmental endpoints are fair game. There's a lot of, it has the same broad purview in all cases, but I'm wondering if different agencies really practice it very differently, or have their own guidance about, what they would expect.
I think, yes. I mean, there is a broad overview as to the NEPA regulations and what an environmental assessment is, what an environmental impact statement might include. But of course, federal agencies have developed their own infrastructure, their own emphasis on certain areas, and their own interpretation of the statutory authorities that they are authorized to implement. I don't think they're so wildly different that you would necessarily get a different result, but they can be modestly or incrementally different in a way that the emphasis is going to be on a different syllable, so you could get one result here versus another one there. But that's the nature of the federal fabric of regulatory guidance generally. You can never necessarily predict what is going to come out of a process that is being administered by multiple agencies and multiple offices within those agencies that are guided by different regulatory guidances that are artifacts of processes that preceded you as an innovator, by many, many years. And our job as practitioners is to try as best we can to anticipate and inform and try to rationalize, but in all cases, it is not transparent because many of the reviews that the agencies engage in are not public. We don't necessarily have the information or the inputs that come into a process that will yield a regulatory decision that might be public, but not the inputs on which that decision is based. So there are many good reasons for why the system is not as predictable or as transparent as it is. We certainly appreciate, recognize, honor, respect, and adhere to the need for confidentiality and think that's very important. But it does frustrate one's ability to anticipate and understand and certainly explain some of the disparate results that Todd alluded to, because to a layperson or even to a lawyer or scientist, some of the results are anomalous, and they are hard to rationalize. But to keep things simple, getting back to opportunities to improve, there is a fabulous opportunity now with the modernizing of the coordinated framework to inform, assist, and educate so we can address some of these anomalous results, or at least understand why they are, and to the extent tweaks need to be made to either statutory authority, which may well be the case, or enhanced guidance, or just better transparency, and so that lessons learned in one agency under one review can be extrapolated as best they can to another agency review so we don't reinvent the wheel. I know we see that all the time. And it's not a good thing or a bad thing, it just is. And it's an artifact of the system that we have and the balkanization and stovepiping of these delegations of regulatory authorities that have evolved over the last 50 years. So we can't expect change quickly, but we can expect change smartly by helping to understand what the gaps are, how can we improve, and it all, to me, begins with what do we as stakeholders want? Because we should be masters of our destiny here. We should be helping the government understand what we're doing and how we're doing it. Because you sure as hell can't expect EPA, with as limited resources as it has, which are diminishing by the day, to understand how your new technology that is fabulous in all respects fits neatly within a paradigm that is old and not in all cases well-suited nimbly to address quickly and efficiently and transparently and predictably that trajectory. Next question.
You go in the back there. Just wait for a mic. All right. You have the glasses. Yeah, just stand up. Thanks.
Hi, my name is Evan Bromfield. I'm with Center for Food Safety. Speaking of the recommendations that you just came out with, if you had to select one of those to push for either in the OSTP comments or otherwise, which would it be? And again, besides the upcoming OSTP comments, what would your venue of advocating for it be?
Good questions. I guess if I had a magic wand and had my way, I would certainly want all of the federal agencies that have jurisdictional authority and jurisdictional relevance here for purposes of this continuum and constellation of technologies to be given more resources, because I think that's a huge problem, and it's just getting worse by the day. You can't expect federal agencies to be, spot on and state-of-the-art when they are crippled by not having sufficient resources to bring in new people that are facile and technologically literate with respect to these technologies. And I think it's kind of shameful that federal agencies are being limited in their allocation to help these technologies along. And as Todd and Dave and others here at the center have noted repeatedly in some of your other missives, the speed with which these technologies are coming on through synthetic biology is quickening to a very surprising extent. I mean, just recently, Mark and Rich, you were at EPA's bioalgae get-together.
Genetically modified algae meeting,
I mean,
talking about the increasing prevalence of algae species within the MCAN process within OPPT. So not only have they seen an increase in MCANs, but now they're seeing species that they hadn't seen before. So there's new scientific understanding that's needed for the regulatory review, because it's not the traditional industrial microorganisms. So you've got more cases that need to be reviewed and technologies that more understanding is required, and both of those speak to need for increased resources, and that's just been lacking.
Well, and one metric is the spike in the number of MCAM and other TSCA notifications, right? I'm looking at you because I know you're an EPA representative, but to the extent that there is one metric of demonstrating that the speed of innovation is quickening the pace and the burden on federal agencies. So the simple answer to your question in a very long-winded way is I think federal agencies need more resources, and they need more access to information regarding what these technologies are on a real-time basis, because by the time you have spent 5, 6, 7, 8 years in evolving a technology, and then you seek to get it commercialized, and you've spent hundreds of millions of dollars in perfecting your new widget. If the agencies are not prepared to go through a predictable and orderly regulatory review, that means you are going to be delayed in commercializing that product. Your opportunity to get a return on your investment is frustrated. You might lose your financial backing before you get to yes, and that has to be avoided. But again, there's a shared burden on all of the stakeholders in this process, and we really haven't even talked about Capitol Hill. I mean, in the heyday of the nanotechnology project, the Project on Emerging Nanotechnologies, there was a very well-oiled nanotechnology caucus within Congress. We had a bipartisan support in the House and Senate that enabled stakeholders to go in and talk about some of these evolving technologies in the nanospace to help educate lawmakers and their staff as to what these technologies are, their promise, what they can do, and why existing regulatory and statutory authorities are adequate for purposes of demonstrating the safety standard. There isn't a similar opportunity now in Congress for so many reasons, not the least of which Republicans, Democrats seldom speak with one another. But again, educating decision makers and lawmakers and their staff on these evolving technologies is such an important process, and yet it's not happening, to my eye. Maybe it's going on behind closed doors, but to my eye, I don't see the level of opportunity and engagement to help our lawmakers understand what these technologies are, the benefit they offer, and why the process needs to be improved.
And just quickly, if the website is back up and working, if you're watching online and want to send a question, you can tweet it to us at SynBioProject.
Eleanor Powells from the Wilson Center. I'm with the Science and Tech Innovation Program. So just on that exact point, beyond the legal technicalities and this question of funding, what do you think is missing between Silicon Valley and Washington, D.C. to actually improve that trust relationship between innovators and policymakers, also between innovators policymakers and the public. And you talked about the modernization of the landscape from a regulatory point of view. There is also changes happening in terms of the actors playing in that innovation ecosystem. So you get more and more non-traditional actors like growing plant project, you know, using other ways of funding, other ways of reaching out to the public beyond, you know, before everybody actually knows about the project. So what's missing in that specific Silicon Valley, Washington, D.C. link? Is it the Congress? Is it a caucus? Is it, you know, a form of engagement we have not been thinking about? And then a second quick question about Oxitec. It's actually a British company. Do you have any insight into how they're going to work in Europe? Or, I mean, they might not need to actually, I mean, the application might not have a faith in Europe for different reasons, but do you have any insight into how the regulatory discussion is being framed there?
Well, I'll take a shot at your first question. And it also embedded in your question is, I think, an inference that there is a lack of trust between Washington and Silicon Valley being, I guess, the surrogate for the investor community, right? I don't know if it's a lack of trust so much as it is a lack of information. And I think to the extent that the coordinated framework memorandum that came out July the 2nd specifically talks about opportunities for greater transparency, public education, public engagement, I'm a huge believer, I guess I shouldn't be using the word huge that much these days to bring up a bad memory, but to the extent there are opportunities to educate and to demystify, which is one of our recommendations, and just communicate better, using some of the tools that you talked about. The fact that we have opportunities through the internet, we have opportunities through crowdfunding, we have opportunities through just greater transparency generally in talking about what the innovation is, why it's important, why all of this money has gone into it, and why we need action fast, or at least a predictable trajectory so investors don't give up. There are lots of opportunities to do that. So I don't know if it's necessarily, would push back a little bit on a lack of trust, which suggests that there might be animus or something else afoot here, where I think it's just a lack of understanding that all stakeholders in that process need to be better about communicating. As to the Oxitec, I would defer to Cheryl.
I was just going to say just a little bit more on that first point. I mean, from what we've seen, I mean, from the regulatory pathways that have occurred, you know, there's not a lack of trust. I mean, there seems to be engagement between regulators and the regulated community, and, you know, communication, sharing of information. I do think, you know, consistent with the comments invited on the coordinated framework, you know, a lot of the interagency discussion on the coordinated framework is sort of inward-looking. So having a better way for innovators to come in and say, okay, where do I start? Golly, is this APHIS or is this CVM or is there something else and how I end up there? You know, I think that level of communication would be great. I think where there seems to be more distrust is public communication, and I think that's, you know, always the case. How do we communicate good science to the public in a way that's can be embraced and understood? And it seems like what Oxitec has encountered both up in New York with the moth release, and continues to encounter in Florida with the, you know, no progress so far on the mosquito, is concerns amongst the public about, you know, has this been adequately vetted, and you know, what's been the process and why shouldn't I be concerned? And, you know, good science and public outreach, I mean, continues to be, you know, I think a lot has been written on, and I don't personally have the answer to that, but that certainly seems to be a huge weakness going forward. I don't know, Rich, if you had.
No, I think you hit all the points. The one thing I would add is that the interagency discussion there is, right, that's an additional burden that's placed on these agencies that, again, they don't have the resources to do. It's, you know, it's non-trivial to be able to, you know, for folks at CVM and APHIS to be talking about these, about their very similar decisions that they're going to have to make, but they're so focused on the reviews that they're responsible for, that they may not have that the ability or the bandwidth really to reach out to the other regulators. So that goes back to the original point about the resources.
Funding, yeah. Well, and in our experience where we've had, you know, products that come under the jurisdiction of multiple agencies, it seems as though the crosstalk is done on a very ad hoc basis. So if this is going to become something that becomes more and more important, more regular, it's got to be institutionalized. We have better ways to have the agencies talk to each other, share resources maybe as part of the funding solution, and institutionalize that, you know, have a ombudsperson for it or something.
Well, that goes to our recommendation to have some embedded ombudsperson
Right.
or technological maven, because harvesting information that is embedded in a particular office, I know this sounds insanely ridiculous, but getting information from one small office and the 2 or 3 people, the reviewers on a particular project, is hard. And so I appreciate, respect, and understand how the federal family of regulators may not be easily able to be on the same page in terms of sharing information and moving forward efficiently and expeditiously and transparently, even within how information is shared among federal regulators. But I think we can do better, but we need to have a conscious effort to do so. And our thoughts, this again, October 6th Federal Register notice that raises, you know, a very finite number of questions, five questions, providing comment on that and being thoughtful about what would be helpful, I think is a huge opportunity that nobody in this room or on this webcast should ignore. And my big concern is that because it was embedded in the Federal Register on October the 6th, and you know, we in our office, being the nerds that we are, we're like, woo, this is fantastic. But how many people actually saw the Federal Register notice? And how many people are now poised to respond to a very aggressive November 13th timeframe, asking very, very fundamental, you know, questions that are thoughtful, they're very well framed, but they will elicit answers that need to be thoughtfully calibrated and written in a way that inform the rulemaking and federal review process. So that's just the easiest thing to do right here, right now. I began our remarks by saying we wanted to make this very granular, very practical, because as we move through, you know, our calendars at work, with every passing day, you have new information, new technologies, new interpretations of existing laws, a TSCA that may be reauthorized in a few short weeks or months or maybe never. And what do we as stakeholders do to improve the process? And we just cannot rely upon the federal family now to do all the thinking for us. We should be jump-starting what the answers to the questions are. We should be helping the federal agencies build a better mousetrap, because these are our innovations and it's our future at stake. So I'm really very, very keen on getting a robust response to these questions to the agencies quickly, so we can inform the process and get to where we could and should be.
Maybe over there in the back.
Neil MacDonald from Federal Technology Watch. I'd like to direct this question to Cheryl about Oxitec. Have you any indication of what the European organizations involved in regulation have actually decided in either of these cases or both of these cases, how they're going to treat it? Because it's very important that the coordination between the regulation of these in Europe and with the regulatory agencies in the US is consistent, and it goes back also to, of course, the nanotech project, where it was very important to make sure that how it was perceived and how the agency, some of the same ones, dealt with it in Europe and dealt with it in the United States.
Well, I think it's an excellent question. Regrettably, I've focused very much in the United States. I'm not sure, and be happy to research that. But you know, you raise a good point, and certainly on an increasing basis, certainly EPA, you know, has done a lot more work sharing across the pond and with the EU and with Canada and with elsewhere. So, I mean, that's another factor that definitely needs to be considered and is, you know, a way to harness the thinking that's been done elsewhere.
Well, I know the OECD has a number of very useful committees that are working on that, and I think our friends with the Biotechnology Industry Organization who are here in the room may participate in that. So to the extent OECD is fulfilling a role of seeking to share information, not harmonize, but at least ensure that everyone is aware of how these various grants of authority legislatively and in other directives in other jurisdictions are addressing these. That's a useful venue, just as it was useful for purposes of working the Nano project. The Working Party of Nanotechnologies, OECD, was and continues to this day to be hugely helpful in sharing information. And I know, Todd, your work on various treaties and international directives should be noted here.
Yeah, I mean, well, just to point out, Oxitec is no longer a British company. It was bought by Intrexon, which is a local company. That doesn't change the international component to it. But just to add to that, there's currently a process going on within the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity, specifically looking at synthetic biology. And I was just at that meeting a couple of weeks ago, and that is not clear yet in terms of what the outcome of that is going to be. But in essence, what they are looking at is whether synthetic biology is going to be treated differently than the current living modified organism structure within that particular convention. And so the short answer is stay tuned, because it's not clear what the end result of that discussion is going to be. But the U.S., as I'm sure you know, looks at genetically modified organisms much different than much of the rest of the world does. And so those rules are most likely going to be very different country to country, depending on where you're looking to introduce any particular product or application.
Well, what are the range of options that might be the end point of that process, Todd? That might be helpful to just, what are the options that are on the table being considered?
Every option is, to be quite honest with you, is on the table. But I mean, it went from a strict moratorium,
Right.
which we're not at the moment, but looking at whether the current system of living modified organisms under that convention can capture some of these applications. I think that may or may not happen. Again, it's not clear. But really, it looks like they're looking at a separate type of review process. And this is mostly on sort of a risk assessment standpoint. This is under the Convention of Biological Diversity. So it's obviously about products that are being put out into the environment and what the impacts of that would be. So it's a very sort of specific set of questions that are looked at within that convention. But it should be noted that pretty much every country, minus the US, is a signatory to that convention. And so if you're a company that, as most are, is an international company, those types of treaties and conventions will come into play in terms of whether or not you're going to be able to at all introduce that application into a country, but probably more importantly, what kind of data you're going to need to require, what kind of risk assessments you're going to need to be done. And those, again, are sort of open discussions that are happening now in terms of what that end process eventually looks like.
Which adds a whole different layer of complexity to the commercialization paradigm.
It makes the U.S. one look simple.
Exactly, exactly. It's just it's simple and possible.
Right.
So if you're spending lots and lots of money in supporting a commercialization here, the lack of certainty regarding whether you can repurpose those data, that investment in Europe, in Asia, and elsewhere, makes that commercial challenge all the more daunting. And there's no easy resolution in sight on that front.
I mean, it's a process, so right. It's a very sort of it's a clear process in terms of how the UN operates in terms of getting to an eventual rule on that. But it's an ongoing one that's happening right now. So, and that's another one where there is opportunity for stakeholders to become involved in that. That period sort of just ended recently, but there will probably be additional opportunities for stakeholders to become involved in that, because that particular convention actually allows NGOs, industry, educational institutions to actually be at those particular, not necessarily in the room negotiations, but in the larger settings when the parties are meeting, for you to be there. So it's not as closed door as some of the other conventions. So there's lots of opportunities for people to become engaged in that process.
And your synthetic biology portal often notes the opportunity to comment and participate in
Yeah,
those.
when those opportunities come up, we do our best to try to get that information out there for people to, as individuals, participate in that process, or we can try to sort of link you up with the right person, whether it's in your country with your country's representative who is actually the negotiator to be a part of that. But that's an ongoing process that by December of 2016 will be completed. So that sounds like it's far off, but in UN time, that's actually a pretty quick
Oh, that's a blink of an eye.
decision-making turnaround, so.
And again, from the perspective of an innovator or from some university spinoff that has a new product, I mean, these are really daunting challenges, just getting through the process here in the United States. It's not like you put an application in and then you're seamlessly and effortlessly directed to what the pathway forward is. If you put an overlay of, well, where do we go from here internationally, it's completely unclear. So again, it's not to say it's good or bad, but from the perspective of the innovator, many of whom are small startups that don't have robust EHS or product stewardship staffs or lawyers that can kind of go in there and lay out the process forward and tell the investment community, yes, by 2016, you will have X. That level of predictability is just not there. And I think to the extent we as stakeholders can improve that process, we can and should do so.
We have a question from Twitter, I
A
think.
couple of Twitter questions. Pat Rizzuto wants to know, with all the talk on Capitol Hill about supporting small business but distrust of federal agencies, how can a bridge be built? And In a Quest wants to know, to avoid delay in commercialization, how soon early should an innovator reach out to a federal agency?
We'll leave it to Pat Rizzuto to ask a very, very good question. You know, there is a lot of support for small business, and the problem is these are very arcane and somewhat rarefied issues. We've worked with the Small Business Administration on a number of occasions trying to educate SBA and educate our colleagues up on the Hill, as I noted, through various caucus opportunities, as to what it means to an innovator, to a small business that doesn't have an army of lawyers or other advocates at its behest to lay a pathway forward to get to yes on their product. I think it just is relentless advocacy, it is relentless education, it is making sure you wave the small business flag, because with this particular Congress, there is a lot of support for aiding new business and the small business person in the United States, because it does have an important impact on the economy. If you have a new product that you can get out and into the commercial space quickly and employ people and make the world a better place, what's not to like? The problem is we've got a lot of challenges that confront industry today, and this is one very, very, very small and somewhat difficult to articulate and explain slice of the pie. So I do think Congress is very sympathetic, but how do we easily telegraph the message as to what is needed and why is the challenge. But this, again, getting back to our fast approaching November 13th opportunity, let's try to get SBA engaged. Let's try to make sure that everyone in this process appreciates the need to bring more predictability and transparency to the process. What was?
And as to the timing question, I mean, you know, arguably as early as you can. I think
yeah.
it depends on your objective. I mean, if you want to educate yourself or educate whatever agency you think needs to be educated, certainly can go in early. You know, I think if you want more certainty or some guidance, the more specificity you have about your product, the better, and knowing what it is and what your intended uses are and how its methodologies and so forth, I mean, depending upon the product and the regulatory paradigm involved. But you know, certainly earlier, err on the earlier side, and I think, you know, why would, other than just simply resources, would a company be reluctant to do that? It's usually confidentiality, but that certainly can be managed.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add that how far in advance depends a lot on the statutory authority, because there's a lot of different timeframes for the statutory review. So you may need to leave more time for things that have that heavier lift.
Yeah, I'm assuming in all cases we're talking about well in advance of, you know, 90 days for a PM, for an MCAN or something like that, or, I mean, even if that would clear.
Just to build on that, so, I mean, because a lot of these companies are small, they're 2, sometimes 3 or 4 people.
Right.
From a practical standpoint, if I'm a new startup company and I have a product, like, where do I start? Like, let's just use the glowing plants example. If I was even knew that I needed to go talk to an agency, is there a number I call? Like, how do I even begin that process of figuring out do I just call 1-800-HELP-EPA and they direct me to the right person? Is there a practical process for a new startup company to even enter that realm?
Well, we put out at 1-800 call Todd. And they're directed to your cell phone, Todd. No, there is no one place. But again, one of the reasons why we participated in this project, and one of the reasons we're so supportive of the Wilson Center project on emerging nanotechnologies and synthetic biology, is there's a lot of practical information that is available through your website and through the federal government. Through our website, we try very hard to get information out to the young startups out there, because this space is unclear, it's complicated, and breaking it down and unpacking it into bite-sized pieces to help the innovator move forward is not easy. But a lot of our people are 2 or 3 person companies that want to get their new pixie dust commercialized, and it's not clear what door do you knock on first. But in that regard, I want to again give a shout out to our colleagues in the federal government who are ready, willing, and able often for pre-submission meetings to lay out what they believe to be the case, to provide helpful information on fashioning your petition or your notification in a way that is sensible and likely to invite the least amount of delay. It doesn't get to the question, well, how do I know I need to ask? And the answer to that is, well, if you're in this space and you're innovating, you know, there is some burden on you as a manufacturer to look to see what your technology is subject to. And with the internet and reliable information sources like Woodrow Wilson, you know, there's no good reason why you can't study up and be in a well-informed manufacturer. But no, there's no start here. There's no government portal that says, if you're in this space, this is what you need to do. Our report is intended in part to help demystify that process.
Maybe that's a recommendation we make for that new portal. I saw some other, maybe we'll go to Mark up here.
I've been waiting a while. First, I want to thank you very much for your comments. I think there's a lot of stuff that we can use. I want to assure you.
Mark, do you want to introduce yourself so people
I'm Mark
know?
Siegel from EPA, and I want to assure you that, in fact, the team that is working to deal with reviewing the existing coordinated framework and all the activities that you've been alluding to all along have, in fact, been thinking along the same lines or similar lines to those that you have been describing. So we're listening. We have been listening. We have been anticipating a lot of what you were thinking about. I want to actually reiterate what you've been saying and encourage people to contribute to the request for information that went out on October 6th. But I'm going to turn to Todd, and he's going to hate me for saying this. But one of the very useful things would be for you to scramble to get the notes from this meeting into the docket or whatever it is for that request for information before it closes, because that will be quite useful. If nothing else, then to describe attitudes, which is something that we have to understand. It's not that we haven't heard it before, but by having it in writing, it's really going to help everybody do their job. So sorry about that, but that will be very helpful. There is one thing that I want to add. From your recommendations, Lynn, one of the interesting ones that I see, and I'm not going to comment on a lot of them, but One of them is your use of the term intervention and how that would be received by some of the skeptics, especially of this technology, with the potential implication of pressure on the federal government coming from those who are possibly the subject of oversight. How I understand what you're getting at in terms of making sure that everybody's on the same page and we all understand the status of the technology and we've got the best information. But the mode is one that's, I think, something that has to be very carefully thought out. And I'm not going to go any farther than that. I'm just suggesting that maybe public perception is an issue and that that's something that you may have to deal with if you're going to pursue that approach.
I think that's a great point, Mark, and thank you for your comments regarding what might be helpful for the interagency work group that is dealing with the modernizing of the coordinated framework. And I think Todd we were quite literal in saying we're just going to pop the report into the docket for what it's worth. And we use the term intervention not without caution. I mean, we recognize that there are detractors of every technology. That doesn't mean one can ignore it. It means I think we have a greater burden to help educate. And I've said this in the context of our recommendations to clients on nanotechnologies. It's not something to hide or under a bushel basket. We recognize that words, concepts, technologies are quickly demonized in ways that might undermine the efficacy of the technology and really hinder opportunities to have consumers and others embrace those technologies. But you know, that's just life in the big city. You know, the manufacturers and supporters of these technologies have got to do a better job of getting out there, getting their narratives, getting their facts, getting their bases out to the public to help invite greater consumer and public acceptance, recognizing that we want people to know what these technologies are capable of, why they are safe, and to the extent that there are risk issues, how those risks are abated through whatever regulatory process has preceded it in ways that prevent risk from happening. I just don't know how else to respond to the question other than there are always going to be detractors, there are always going to be issues, but they need to be addressed, not avoided, and the public space and consumer awareness and appreciation of these technologies and what they offer is very, very, very much a part of the paradigm, and I think has been underlooked and underappreciated as a force that will move these technologies forward or prevent them from being commercialized. Rich?
Yeah, and let me just add that also the public confidence that the regulatory machinery is working properly. That you know, because much of this is confidential. That there needs to be some trust that the regulatory agencies have sufficient information and sufficient knowledge to make that informed risk decision, so that there is public confidence in the process.
And similarly, some of that communication, right, has to come from the regulatory agencies, because I'm sure that even if it's very well reasoned on, you know, the public websites, it's still going to be suspect coming from the manufacturers.
Oh, absolutely. And I don't know what the answer to that is. You know, there are so many issues, you know, wrapped up in your question, Mark. I mean, the protection of confidential business information. How do we ensure that our technologies are not pirated by entities that, you know, will do a disservice to what their intent is? How do we compensate innovators through various data compensation schemes that exist under TSCA and FIFRA and the patent protection system? But the truth of the matter is, you know, innovators have to recognize that in order to invite and secure public confidence in these innovations, more information needs to be shared to give people a practical perspective as to what they are, what review they embraced and endured by federal agencies. It's often many times over, as some of our Oxitec case studies demonstrate. And that, at the end of the day, it's a process, they're a participant, and information is, the way to go. I just don't know what else to say, other than we need to do a better job of educating the public.
I didn't suggest it was an easy question.
And it isn't.
Just observed
Yep.
when one doesn't pay attention to public perception, the best aims sometimes.
I totally
Absolutely.
agree.
The question over here.
The gentleman at the back.
Oh, wait, we're in the back and then we'll come up front.
Hi, this is Frank Hurl. I'm with NIOSH, and I was wondering if you had considered worker health and safety regulations in the mix of things that you were talking about for people who manufacture, amplify, and distribute these agents. And I guess in particular, I was thinking along the lines of, say, OSHA's hazard communication standard, or I'm not sure about the mosquito vector thing, whether that would fall under any kind of bloodborne pathogen, but I mean, there's a couple of things that might apply.
The worker space was not really a focus of our review. We are very mindful of the need for education in that regard. We are very appreciative and mindful of NIOSH's extraordinary work in the nano space. Chuck Geraci's team has done a phenomenal job of providing useful guidance documents for innovators, small innovators, and others embracing nanotechnologies, and what personal protective clothing, equipment, and work practices can be embraced, many of which would apply here, to ensure that exposure is limited. We simply didn't focus on it here, but we recognize that NIOSH has played a very important role in supporting the dissemination of very, very useful information on mitigating potential risk in the workplace. And with respect to the hazard communication standard under the Occupational Safety and Health Act, absolutely. We really didn't focus on it here, but those are alternative means for communicating information to the public, to workers, and to others in the value chain as to what risk might be present in the workplace and how to mitigate and protect against those risks. And NIOSH has done a fabulous job in nano, and to the extent a lot of those guidance documents can be repurposed and addressed here, I'm sure small innovators and laboratories at academic institutions and elsewhere would be well advised to take a look at the website.
Just to build on that, to that first report I mentioned about the federal funding, that's another important aspect when you actually go in and look at the actual projects that have been funded. There's no money in that space right now, and it's something that we've been trying to sort of put a little bit of a light on in terms of what I would argue is some of the lack of coordination at the federal level from their research agencies in terms of synthetic biology, if we want to call synthetic biology, right, a research program. That's something that's lacking if you compare it particularly to the NNI, where they had coordination going on amongst the research agencies so they could identify some of those areas where there maybe needed to be more focus. But right now, we don't have that kind of coordination going on amongst the research agencies, and I think that is evident when you look at sort of the really lack of any kind of real risk research funding going into agencies like NIOSH or EPA and some of the other agencies that under NNI had some dedicated funding to ask those types of questions.
Hi, I'm Rick Steinheiser, and I'm a currently independent consultant, former government. So I just want to go back to who's funding a lot of the work. And one of the orange bars there on the graph was DARPA. Okay, and for my previous existence, years ago, I've helped work with and start a lot of DARPA programs. And so scientists just don't go to DARPA and say, hi, I'm a professor at wherever, and I'm really doing cool work in nano. Most of my work, or the stuff that we funded on, was in computer science or electrical engineering, okay? So now you get to synthetic bio, okay? The audience there, the customers that the scientists have to communicate to, and fellow government people like me, I'm retired CIA. So we had to say, there's a threat. They made, who's they? Well, we won't worry about who they are. So you're trying to convince lawmakers, people that don't have techie degrees, but a lot of the military that had to say, how is synthetic bio going to save the life of a soldier in the field? Convince me. How is that going to help us figure out if they're genning up really nasty new synthetic bios in some vat in some underground location? It's not, so, okay, so it takes a long time to communicate that to the people who will eventually sign off and write the check for DARPA to put X amount of money into a program. Have you looked at any of those kind of discussions that are precursors for when a BAA, a broad agency announcement, gets proposed so that they so that university professors in particular can submit proposals? Okay, it's always a selling job, even if you're in the government. I empathize with you.
Well, you raise obviously a very good point, and one that we are challenged with all the time. I mean, often in some of our representations, getting the federal government to appreciate that a new antimicrobial product embedded in fabric for soldiers out in the field can be protective of, that's important and it's a good selling point, but it doesn't necessarily mean there's a different process. I mean, like anything else, if it's for the government, you have to play by the rules. There might be certain off-ramps and benefits bestowed based on specifications in the regulations that favor government actions in some regard. But at the end of the day, yeah, you have to state the case, demonstrate why a particular ask is critical, essential, important, and argue accordingly. That's what we do. Other questions?
Back there, and then we'll come up here to the front.
Hi, this is Rachel Levinson from Arizona State University. Just a point of information I thought Mark was going to give, that about half an hour ago, OSTP announced that FDA will be hosting the first of 3 public meetings, gathering public comments on the RFI. So
And that, Rachel, that will
October-
be when?
October 30th at FDA, 9:30 to 1. You can register online.
At FDA White Oak facility.
Yep.
So they make it
It's
easy
open
to
to the
get there.
public and no cost or anything like that.
Thank you for adding that. We had heard rumors to that effect, but it's helpful to say here that,
I wasn't sure when it was going to be announced, so I couldn't, and I didn't see your note completely
Text
before
it.
that.
We'll take one more question up here in the front.
I was just wanting to follow up on one of the remarks that you made, Lynn, about TSCA reform. And if I followed correctly, you were saying that any possible recasting of the legislation allowed for some positive changes for new technologies. And I was just wondering if you could expand on that a little bit.
well, for example, if you look at the Senate version, eliminating the least burdensome provision in TSCA Section 6 arguably would give EPA greater authority to identify and address risks under its TSCA 6 authority, to the extent that the agency under, again, the Senate version has a prioritization scheme that identifies low and high priority chemicals for review and would require that the manufacturer of those chemicals that are being subject to assessment as a high priority chemical, the burden of demonstrating safety is on it as opposed to under current law where the burden is on EPA to demonstrate that something or a chemical poses an unreasonable risk. I think those are improvements that give the agency greater authority to both compel the production of information, make certain risk findings, and hold the manufacturer to a safety standard that it is not now under the current TSCA statute with respect to existing chemicals. Under TSCA Section 5, new chemicals, of course, the agency has greater latitude. But some of those authorities would certainly benefit EPA in addressing some of the challenges that have been identified both in our report and certainly in the Venter report. And Sarah, you had identified a number of specific statutory provisions in your report that I don't think in the 2013 version of the Senate version have made it through a minimum data set, for example. That is not in current legislative initiatives pending in Congress. But again, I think the big picture is that if TSCA were to be reformed, there are greater opportunities for EPA to obtain information and make risk findings and determine that new or existing chemicals are in fact not meeting an established safety standard. And these are authorities that the agency does not now have under existing law. So Sarah, if you had anything you wish to add. I didn't want to mischaracterize the Venter report, but there are a number of specific recommendations or opportunities that are more expressly identified in the Venter report than there are in ours. And again, because TSCA reform is mature, we are very hopeful that it will emerge soon. And in whatever form, I think it will expand the agency's ability to review, assess, and procure information to make safety findings, which I think we can all get behind and support.
All right, well, I want to thank everyone here for coming. I also want to thank Lynn, Cheryl, Richard, and the rest of your team for sort of working through a report, which is always difficult to do a report on emerging technologies, as they found that the information changes while you're actually writing it.
Daily.
But just to let everyone know, the report is available both on our project at symbioproject.org as well as Bergeson and Campbell's website, which I don't know the exact web address, so you can.
It's www.lawbc.com.
And as well as the individual case studies. And our hope is that sort of over time we'll be adding new case studies. So if you have ideas or you know of some new kind of really innovative products or applications that are out there that you think could benefit from a review like this, send them our way and we can see what we can do. So I just want to thank you guys again and thank everyone for coming.
Yeah, thank you very much, everyone, for your attention.